Perfect. Hello, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us today. Do you want to give us a quick introduction as to who you are and why I have you today?
My name is Peter Swanson. I'm the author of 8 mystery novels, including my latest, which is called 9 Lives, which is coming out in March in both the UK and here in the States. And I will be talking about that book, 9 Lives.
Awesome. And I'm so stoked to have you for just 9 questions. So we will kick off with first one, nice and easy. Can you give us a one-line pitch for your book?
Asking for a one-line pitch is never nice and easy, but I will try and do it in one line. I'll probably use semicolons, but the one-line pitch is 9 strangers all receive a letter in the mail, and the letter is simply a list of 9 names. And we'll go semicolon, and then one by one, these 9 strangers begin to be murdered. And the question is, of course, who is doing it, but also what is the connection between them?
Perfect. And I will totally allow your semicolons. We will allow them.
Thank you.
In the book, we meet this ensemble cast of characters of the list that you've mentioned. Where did you find them and who came to you the easiest? And do you have a favorite?
Well, I found them, I think, where I find all my characters, which is they just sort of appear in my head. They're obviously all probably have some small element of me that I'm not even aware of. But in this book, what was fun about it was that I was able to do characters that I don't normally do in books, because they're not sort of classic criminals or classic detectives. These are just sort of random people. The easiest, I think, was the psychopath. Jay Coates is not giving anything away to say he's a budding psychopath, because we learned that pretty early on in the book. He was easy just because I've written that type of character before. But I will say my favorite was probably Arthur Cruz, who I think is one of the gentler characters I've ever written. He's an oncology nurse who's grieving the death of his husband, and he's quite sweet, and I quite enjoyed writing him.
Question 3. Did you intend for readers to be playing their own games of Clue throughout reading?
Anytime you write a whodunit, you have to assume that about half your readership is trying to is starting early on, trying to figure out who the killer is. So yeah, that is always in the back of my mind. And I don't always write whodunits. In fact, I've written several books where sort of the killer is introduced right up front at the beginning of the book, and they're much more whodunits. But I knew this was a whodunit, so I did sprinkle some clues in along the way that I think people should be able to catch. I try not to get too hung up in trying to write this perfect whodunit that no one will guess. I always assume some people will guess the end of it, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, sometimes people are like, oh, you failed at the book because someone guessed. There are very astute readers out there, and I just wanted there to be a clear motive and a clear killer that we're introduced to fairly early on. You hate when a killer comes out of the blue at the end.
Yeah, those are the really kind of the unsatisfying twists when you're introduced to a fresh character and you're like, oh, it was that person.
Yeah.
Right.
No
doubt. So what makes this book different in the writing of it or the reading of it from your others?
Well, it's very different in the sense that it doesn't have essentially a main character, that we follow these 9 random individuals who all react differently to being on this list. And at times I think it was almost like writing short stories, because I was fleshing them all out in the little drama that they had in their lives prior to the letter and how they react. And that I don't necessarily have character through lines. Now there are, of course, and I can't give them away, there are certain characters that last longer than others in this book and sort of emerge as more important, but that wasn't how I wrote it. I really wrote it starting with random characters, and I think it reads that way, and hopefully you'll be surprised as a reader going through it as to in what order they're bumped off, if they're all bumped off. I don't want to give anything away, but
sure.
How it all plays out.
Well, continuing the theme of no spoilers, obviously your book has an ending. Did you always know that that was going to be your ending?
Well, I knew it had to have an ending, and I know that sounds strange to say, but I often write books not knowing the ending.
Hmm.
And in this one, it was a kind of classic whodunit. Essentially, it's the group of people, on an island or on adrift in a snowbank, on a train, that are all getting murdered one by one. So you have to know there has to be a killer. So as soon as I did come up quite early with who the killer was and why the killer was doing it. I did think that was important, and I didn't want to write a book, although it crossed my mind, where it was sort of a vague ending, where it's just sort of death haunting them, a final destination type of thing.
Hmm.
I definitely wanted it to have a very specific person, and a specific motive, so I did know that way in advance.
So you kind of segued me really nice into the next question, because I think when you think about classic crime and you think about these um, isolated environments, we think about Agatha Christie. So
Yeah.
how has Agatha Christie influenced your writing, and how does it come into play in Nine Lives?
Well, I think first of all, like any devoted crime reader, which I am first and foremost, and a crime writer, Agatha Christie is often a very early introduction. I mean, I started reading Agatha Christie probably when I was 10 or 11, and fell in love with the stories. And in particular, my favorite is "And Then There Were None." I just love that setup, the 10 strangers on an island, dying one by one, and I'd always wanted to do essentially my version of that. And it's tricky. It's tricky to come up with a way to put people into that kind of situation. I mean, the island's been done, as I mentioned earlier. You know, the Snowden hotel, or the Snowden train, has been done. So I came up with this idea that maybe they're not trapped in a place, but they're trapped by the fact that they're on this kind of kill list. And that's what isolates them from other people. So really, this was an homage to "And Then There Were None."
I love that. Isolated by pen ink. I think that's a great hook.
Yes.
So tell me, what kind of writer are you? What does your writing routine look like? And especially when you're writing a book as deftly plotted as this, I imagine you have to be quite plot strict.
I'm actually not, and
Okay.
I'm not on any of my books. I don't outline, and I don't write sticky notes. I don't write any notes. I do a lot of like mind organizing, and one of the reasons I do that is um, I like to daydream a lot. About part of my process of writing is daydreaming, or thinking about the book, and I figure if it can stay in my head, it makes sense that it'll eventually go to the page. In other words, if I come up with great ideas, they'll stick. So I kind of use that as a method. Um, in the case of Nine Lives, while I did have the overarching plot in my mind, I was playing around with it as I went, especially on who would be the next victim and how that would play out. So I did allow some leeway, and I think it's important, at least for me, in order to keep the book fresh.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Okay, so we know that you are a massive Agatha Christie fan, as most crime thriller readers are. But what are you reading right now? Do you have any culture recommendations for our community? Think books, film, TV, podcasts, anything.
Yeah, so I'll do them all. So I'll start with books. I did really enjoy the new Anthony Horowitz, A Line to Kill, A Line to Kill. His kind of clever series where he inserts himself in the books. And then again, we have a theme, which is Agatha Christie, and I did just reread Death on the Nile, which I hadn't read since I was a child, and I think I kind of read it again, partly because the movie's coming out, and that plot has always been interesting to me. But I love that book again. I prefer it to Murder on the Orient Express, just as a novel. Murder on the Orient Express has that very clever ending, but I think other than that, the story as it's told is not as exciting as Death on the Nile, which I've loved. So that's two book recommendations. For movies, I just saw The Dry, which was Jane
Mm-hmm.
Harper's book, starring Eric Bana as Australian detective. It's a very old-fashioned whodunit, and I think it was really good. And he was terrific. And I feel like I haven't seen him for a while, and that was a surprise that I hadn't heard a lot about, and then I thought it was great. And then for television, I really enjoyed, like everyone else in the world, Yellow Jackets. I don't know if you have that in the UK yet.
It actually doesn't ring a bell. You say everybody else in the world, and I was like, oh, maybe I've missed this one. Maybe I've been living under a rock.
The Showtime series stars Melanie Linsky and
Mm-mm.
Juliette Lewis, and it's about girls who are a soccer team in the 1980s. They're marooned in the wilderness and go kind of all Lord of the Flies, and then it's their adult version. So when it comes out, it's a lot of fun. And then the other one I watch, which I know you have over there, is Vigil, which I love because that was such a classic, closed room
Mm-hmm.
detective story, but updated to be on this nuclear submarine. But it was such a clever concept to take a detective, and of course a detective with claustrophobia, which she sort
Yeah.
of mentioned prior to taking on the job, that put her on a submarine with no contact with the outside world and have her solve a murder. I mean, that's just about the best premise on TV this year. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, we loved Vigil, and in particular that scene where she gets trapped in the tube.
Unbelievable.
Felt like
Terrible.
I was suffering from claustrophobia at that moment in time.
Yeah, I'm not great with small spaces myself. So yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Perfect. And then last question. So for any of our community who are new to your work, after whizzing through 9 Lives, what should we be reading next?
Of my books.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah. So if you want to revisit, I'll give you two ways to do it. A lot of 9 Lives takes place in the town of Kennewick, Maine, which is an imaginary town in southern Maine that I've set several books in. So if you want to return to Kennewick, I would recommend The Kind Worth Killing, because there's all sorts of shenanigans that happen in that same town in that book. But if you want to stick with the number theme, I will recommend 8 Perfect Murders, which was actually not titled 8 Perfect Murders in the UK. It was titled The Rules for Perfect Murders, but it's about a blogger who makes a list of his favorite 8 crimes in fiction, and then those crimes start happening in real life. So I'll recommend those 2 of my books.
I love that. That last one sounds right up my street. But
Yeah.
actually, one bonus question that
Okay.
we won't include, but I'm just super interested, is the benefit of creating your own town in a place that obviously does exist, like Maine. Does that just give you the ultimate freedom?
Yeah, I think that's what it's all about. It's well, there's two. One, yeah, you can just put anything in it that you want to put in it, and
Mm-hmm.
if you want the police station to be right next door to like a good dive bar or something because it
Sure.
works for your plot, um, you're not up against a real place. Now I do use like a lot of writers, like I use Boston. I use the real place, but then when
Mm-hmm.
I do the smaller towns, I make them up. Um, it would be weird to make up a major city. I mean, in a way, if you're a UK writer and you're setting it in London, you wouldn't make up a London.
Yeah.
But it does, and then it stops people from writing you and telling you the, got the streets wrong or whatever. So
Mm-hmm. And it makes sense that people have got the cultural relevance of Massachusetts or Boston or Maine, but then you add
yeah,
this little nugget of your own creation in.
I love the idea of made up towns too, just because I grew up reading them in books. I mean, if you read Stephen King, he has Derry. He has these in Salem's Lot, these towns that are kind of based on other towns, but they just become these really creepy places. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think Kennewick at this point, because I've used it in like 4 books, has just an enormously high murder rate. I mean, maybe not as high as Cabot's Cove, where the Murder She Wrote, Angela Fletcher, lived, because I think someone died there every week. But yeah, I love the idea of little made up little murderous towns.
Awesome. Well, listen, thank you so much for hanging out with me this afternoon. We are celebrating 9 Lives throughout February and March, and you can buy it from the 3rd of March in the UK. So Peter, thanks again for hanging out with me, and keep an eye on the read along content because there'll be loads for you to see online.
Thanks, Les. Nice meeting you.